up a little bit where we left off last week. We're going to kind of overlap. Last week we ended with Daniel chapter 8, with Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. Daniel purposing in his heart that he would not defile himself. So I want to pick up there, and if you're following along the outline in your handouts, just a reminder of the faithfulness that we're going to see demonstrated in Daniel's life all the way throughout. That his character is on display right from the very beginning. As this young man, remember, from Palestine, taken to Babylon, and all the attempts that they made to get him to compromise. They're putting him into a situation. They're trying to even change his identity, change his name to be more in alignment with their culture and their gods, and all these pressures, all these opportunities that Daniel has to compromise. He's away from home. There's all these external pressures, internal pressures, peer pressures, and yet we read in verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat nor with the wine that he drank. He requested, therefore, the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And so we have this demonstration of Daniel's faithfulness right from the get-go. And we're going to see it carried out. We're going to see how this decision, this declaration of his faithfulness plays out in the rest of it. And I think there's a lot of helpful and beneficial lessons for each of us to follow this example. So let's look at, now that this faithfulness has been stated, let's look at how this faithfulness is demonstrated. Let's just walk through a couple of these verses. You can start there in verse 9. It says, "Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. The prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear the Lord my king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? And ye shall make me endanger my head to the king." And Daniel said to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink." What we're going to see in this passage, I think, is a great example of situations that are not maybe all that foreign to us. You may not be in a situation where somebody's forcing you to eat defiled meat or something in that sense, but there are many times where we're going to find ourselves in situations where what's being asked of us is something that in good conscience we can't do. It may be something that's blatantly wrong. It may be something that is just maybe a violation of a conviction that we have, a personal standard. But we may be asked to do something and in a situation where we're being asked to compromise. And specifically in a situation like this where there's kind of these competing obligations. He's got these commands from the Lord that he wants to obey, but now he has this command from his authority, from the people over him that he's expected to obey. And he's having a hard time seeing the reconciliation, how both of these going to work. So as we think about this situation now, as Daniel has made this decision, I'm going to do right by God. How does that play out in how he also tries to be right by those that God has placed over him? So we're going to call this section, maybe just notice a couple of things from this, about how to respond to compromising commands. You ever find yourself in one of those situations where you can't do something in good conscience? We may be, as we go forward in culture, this is not unrealistic to expect at some point our government may ask things of us that in good conscience we say, well, I can't go along with that. You might find yourself, like I said, in a situation at work where even those of us who work in a Christian environment, sometimes there could be things that we like, I don't know if I can do that or not. We have situations in our homes where our spouses or family pressures are asking us to do things. So I want you to think about what Daniel does in this situation. How does he respond to these compromising commands? If he's going to maintain his integrity, his faithfulness, and his commitment to God. Well, call back attention to verse 9. It says, "Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs." One thing I notice about Daniel in this story that's going to make some of these things possible is that Daniel starts out with a good testimony to begin with. He had conducted himself in a manner that, as verse 9 says, brought him into favor and tender love with those around him. The idea of favor here, it's goodwill, sympathy. He had a good testimony. And that's going to be one of the things that allows for the request that he's going to make to even gain a hearing. You think about it, when he's going to request something about this specific instruction, he's going to approach his authority in a very careful and appropriate way. He's not going to adopt a martyr complex. He's not going to stage a sit-in. He's not going to demand his rights, and he's not going to make a big protest out of this. He's simply going to appeal to his authority, have a good spirit, and he created a testimony that demonstrated that this kid is trying to do the right thing. He doesn't have a testimony of always being rebellious and always looking for a way to get out of things and trying to skirt the rules. And you understand how having a good testimony to begin with goes a long way when we find ourselves in a situation where we have to do right by authority. I think some of that goes along with trying whenever we can to do right by authority. A lot of the things that we're asked to do are not moral convictions. Sometimes we would be asked to do things that we just don't want to. And we're like, oh, I just don't want to do that. And we show resistance and we show a poor testimony. Then when something actually comes up, it's just like, oh, you're doing that again, right? But if we have a right testimony to begin with, we have a desire that shows that we want to be right with those over us. We want to be right with those around us. Then when we do have to take a stand, it's created a testimony. It's created an atmosphere that doesn't make authority initially and by default kind of resistant to us. So don't miss the fact that Daniel starts this. One of the reasons why this is going to work out for him is because he starts out with a good testimony. Notice something else he does. If you look back at verse 12, he says, "Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink." One of the things that Daniel and his friends do here is they propose an alternative. They're looking for a way to make this work. And so whatever they're being asked to eat, they're like, well, we can't eat that, but would it be possible for us to have this instead? And so what they ask for is pulse, grains and fruits and vegetables, kind of that idea. If it's the meat that they can't eat, whether it's not kosher meat or maybe it's meat that's been offered to idols, whatever that reason was, he asked for something that didn't cause them to compromise. But notice this, a way that would still accomplish the goal that his authority was trying to accomplish. I mean, the goal that his bosses want here is that you need to be, healthy and fit to serve the king. And so again, Daniel's proposal here is not crazy. He's like, well, okay, I know what you're trying to do. Could I do it this way instead, in a way that doesn't cause me to compromise my convictions? Again, I kind of wonder if that's a step that we miss sometimes when an authority or someone over us asks us to do something. We immediately just default to, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to take my stand. I'm going to stomp my foot and be my, and we think that's the Christian thing to do. Well, if we're trying to do what's right by authority, then can we accomplish authority's goal in a way that doesn't cause us to compromise our convictions? And maybe that's going to take some creative thinking sometimes. Maybe that involves, putting some time and some thought into it. But he does present a viable alternative to accommodate his convictions, but also meet his master's goals. I mean, you got a kid with a good testimony who's trying to help his supervisors succeed and do so in a way that preserves integrity. Listen, it's no wonder throughout the rest of this book this kid keeps getting promoted, because that's the kind of worker that any of us want. And that's the kind of worker any of us should want to be. I also notice when he proposes his alternative, he makes it reasonable. Again, he's not demanding, I've got to bring out a rabbi and he's got to bless my meal so that it's fully kosher. He's not presenting unreasonable, just goofy circumstances. The only way I'm going to work is if you'll do this, and that. He's simply saying, look, I can't eat this. Is there any way we can get this food instead? And it's a very reasonable alternative. There's a lot of wisdom in his proposal. Even the time frame. He says, look, could we have 10 days? He proposes a test period. He says, just give me a test, give us 10 days, and see if we're not accomplishing your goals. See if what we're doing is not doing what you want us to do. And he kind of leaves the door open that, well, after that, we'll have to see. We'll have to make another decision. I assume he's still not going to compromise himself, because he's made that purpose in his heart. But even his proposal is very reasonable. He's trying to be very accommodating in what he's doing. He's doing everything he can to be right with his authority while still preserving his convictions. 10 days is long enough for them to be able to see results, not long enough to incur the king's wrath should the test fail. So he's not going to get his bosses in trouble if this doesn't work out. It's a very reasonable request. And again, we know from other passages that when Daniel acts and behaves wisely, it's going to be the result of prayer. This passage doesn't specifically show that or illustrate that, but that would be very consistent with his character. The Bible tells us in the book of James, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, or give it to all men liberally and upbraid it not. In those scenarios where somebody's asking us to do something, I don't feel like I can do that. Lord, what do? That's the prayer. I need wisdom. And ask God to show you maybe the hidden alternative, the alternate plan, the way to move forward with this. Again, we've kind of since the 60s kind of glorified this aspect of rebellion, taking a stand, staging protest, and even still in contemporary society, somebody sees some decision or some action that they don't like in culture and society, and the default setting is to riot and protest. And I see Daniel here being honored by God by his approach. He's going to stand for what's right, but he's going to do it in the right way. A lot of good lessons for that. I do want to mention one more thing that is true in this story, and we'll see it consistently demonstrated throughout the rest of this narrative as well, is we do need to remember this possibility. This story ends well. We're going to see that in just a moment in verses 13 through 16, that this story does end well, that they are healthier and they are accomplishing the king's objectives, and so the steward is going to say, hey, great, keep doing what you're doing. I'm not going to get in trouble for presenting the king with weakly, sickly individuals. This time it ends well. Understand that when we have to take a stand, it may not always end the same way. We're going to see examples later in this book of compromising situations where there's not really going to be an alternative, and the king's not going to tolerate any kind of disobedience. We'll see it in chapter 3 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who cannot bow down to the throne. And remember that they had to be prepared to be thrown into the fiery furnace. We're going to see Daniel in chapter 6 saying, I can't only present positions to the king. I need to continue to pray to my God. And the consequence of that is to be thrown into a lion's den. Those worked out too. Yeah, but they didn't know that at the time. when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are being thrown into the fiery furnace, they were fully prepared for God can deliver us, but if not, we're going to do what's right. I don't know that Daniel expected to survive the night in the lion's den. We read a story in the New Testament about the apostles who, in Acts chapter 4, were told by the religious leaders, no more preaching, can't talk anymore about Jesus. And they get thrown into prison, and the angel delivers them, and the angel says, go and preach. And so, well, now they have conflicting commands. God's telling them to preach. The religious leaders, their authorities, are telling them not to. And so what do? They go and they preach. And religious leaders call them back in for it and say, hey, what are you doing? We told you not to preach. And that's where Peter makes a statement. We have to obey God rather than men. And a lot of times we end the story right there. You keep reading. It says the religious leaders took them and beat them. They scourged them. They suffered consequences for their act of disobedience, and God didn't deliver them from those consequences. So while we look at this story, and while we want to think that every time we have to do the right thing, it's going to end well, sometimes for us the circumstances are not going to be great, but just remember it's still right to do right. And when we take a stand like this, we're trying our best to do it right. We're trying our best to honor the Lord. Whether that turn ends well for us or whether that ends poorly, understand it's right to honor the Lord in what you do. So you can honor the Lord in your obedience, you can honor the Lord in your reaction to authority, and if need be, we can honor the Lord in persecution for doing that which is right. We'll do a look at how the story ends. Verse 14, says, so he consented to them in this matter, proved them 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine which they should drink, and gave them pulse. And so this story at least does end well. The Lord does honor specifically their decision by giving them continued favor with their authority. So starting in verse 17, the rest of the chapter, it begins to list out some of the ways in which God blessed the faithfulness of these individuals. Because of his purposing in his heart, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to do right no matter what. We're not going to compromise. How was their faithfulness specifically rewarded? Well, notice verse 17. It said, as for these 4 children, God gave them, we call this God's gifts. them, it's Daniel and his friends, but the focus of the story actually for most of the book is going to be on Daniel. But what did God give them? Verse 17, these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill and all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. One of the things, if I could categorize one of the opportunities God's going to give Daniel here, is that he gives him spiritual insight. It says God gave him knowledge and skill and learning. Daniel has this ability to interpret visions and dreams. Not the first time we've seen somebody with this. Joseph had previously had the same benefit of blessing from God. Interestingly, also in a foreign land, serving a foreign king. Some neat parallels there. So Daniel's going to do this. Now that ability to interpret dreams and visions is not only important to these superstitious Babylonians, it's obviously going to be important for the rest of the book. Because one of the things God's going to do repeatedly in this book is give visions and give dreams. And Daniel's going to be the one called on to interpret them. And so I think it's interesting to see that God equipped Daniel and his friends here with wisdom to know what they needed to do in the situations that they were placed in. How that works out for us is probably not going to be the exact same. God's probably not giving you the ability to interpret dreams. And you're probably not going to receive angelic messengers with visions. The application of that for you is probably going to be a little different. But I don't think the situation here is all that different. That God gives access to information and wisdom to people who are willing to accept it. People who are willing to look for it. People who are willing to put it into practice. I think about the information, the access to information about living wisely and understanding in the world in which we live. Do we need wisdom to interact with this culture, with this world? Absolutely we do. And the question is, do we have resources? It may not be the miraculous resource of, like I said, interpreting dreams and visions, but God's given us His Word. As I said before, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally. That God's made resources available. Daniel could understand what to do in his times, and he could know how to interact with his authorities, and he could know how to administer the responsibilities he's been given because he's dependent upon God for wisdom. And I think about that for us, that we need a filter to understand this confusing world in which we live. But God's provided that to us. You watch the news in the evening, and so many people right now are asking the question, what's going on? Why is this happening? What's taking place? And we have the opportunity to minister in that environment. And again, it's not that we have every answer for every situation, but boy, we, through the scriptures, have a whole lot different perspective on the world around us than the world does. If nothing else, we know that there is a God who's in control, and that there is a plan and a purpose, and there is a destination to which He's taking human history. And when people say, I don't know why this person's doing that, and we say, well, the Bible tells us about the nature of man. We know sinful nature, and we know that people make bad choices, and when tragedies happen. Why did this happen, and why did this take place? And we have answers that the world is looking for. We have an opportunity to take the spiritual insight that God gives us and share it with culture and give it to others. One of the reasons Daniel is going to consistently be sought for answers is because he had answers. And I think if we can do that, if we can come to the Word of God, get wisdom, understand the world around us from God's perspective, more people would start asking us those questions. And we would have an opportunity, like Daniel did, to be placed into positions of influence and to be able to minister to the needs of others. It starts with seeking God for wisdom. It starts with putting ourselves into the Word of God and daily just dosing ourselves with wisdom. One of the practical statements that people have made for years, and I haven't done it as faithfully as I should have, but I'm trying to do better about this. Just go to Proverbs every day and just see that wisdom for life, about how to understand situations and circumstances and people. There's so many statements about human nature and just kind of default settings for how to respond to this and how to act with this circumstance and how to respond to this situation. And you start putting those things into practice, and you start making your mind revolve around God's wisdom. And it's amazing what God does with those things. And And so I think one of the reasons we're going to see Daniel so successful is that he knew to get insight from God. That led to another gift that Daniel was given because of the spiritual insight. Verses 18 through 20 talk about increasing in favor before the Babylonians. Verse 18 says, at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, and the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, this had been kind of a 3-year training program that these guys were going through. The methodology of the Babylonians was to take these young, educatable children in, spend 3 years teaching them, training them, preparing them for court service, and then they'd have their graduation ceremony, and then they'd be placed into the king's service. So this experiment that we just looked through apparently is been going on for 3 years. Daniel and his friends have been living perfectly without compromise for all of this time. They graduate at the head of their class. And so what were the results of it? Of their exercise of spiritual wisdom, spiritual insight, standing by their convictions. Verse 19 says, and the king communed with them. And among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. Did the spiritual insight that God gave to Daniel, did it create for him opportunities to exercise that wisdom in a broader context? As he just consistently made choices and made right decisions. You ask the question, does it work? Do people notice? I think even as fallen as our world is today, people notice and appreciate people who have integrity. And maybe even more so as the world gets worse, that individuals who are willing to say, you know what, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to have a right spirit. I'm going to have a right heart. Work, in culture, home, just going to do the right thing. And just doing that consistently, that cream can't help but rise to the top. And I don't mean that's always a promotion at work, but I mean, you demonstrate yourself to be a person of integrity when people have questions. Who are they going to ask? When people have a problem, who are they going to reach out to? When people have a need, where are they going to go? And God wants to put each of us in positions of influence. And it may not always be at the top of the organizational chart, but all of us can have tremendous influence on those around us simply by doing what Daniel and his friends did. Daily, on a regular basis, making choices to do right, constantly seeking input from God, filling yourself with God's wisdom. You do that on a regular basis, and God will give you opportunities to minister to the needs of others. Here it says that the king inquired of them. He figured out real quickly, when nobody else can answer questions, these guys can answer my questions. We're going to see that very graphically demonstrated in chapter 2. This verse may be a summary, a preview of what we're going to see in chapter 2. Chapter 2 would be an example of that, where all the magicians and astrologers of Babylon are just simply, about the king's dream. And it's going to be Daniel and his friends praying that comes in and says, our God can explain this to you. So who do you think the king's going to seek next time he has a problem? I'm not going to go to those guys. I want to talk to Daniel and his friends. That testimony that they had, that spiritual insight, gave them opportunity and favor for others. They were placed in positions of influence. We may not all get to be advisors to kings, but each of us is influencing somebody. So the point here is to have a testimony that maximizes influence. Don't shy away from opportunities to expand that influence. Ask yourself, where are you making a difference right now? Is it an office? Is it a home? Is it a classroom? Co-workers? A church? Demonstrating integrity in all of those environments matters. A third way that God rewarded Daniel here in this case, again, all connected back to verse 8, because he made the decision to not defile himself. One of the things God blessed him with was lasting influence. Verse 21 says, and Daniel continued, even unto the first year of King Cyrus. Again, that's a little foreshadowing. We're going to get later in the book, we get to Daniel chapter 5, and the Babylonian kingdom we'll see comes to an end. The Medes and the Persians will come on the scene, led by a man by the name of Cyrus, and Cyrus, Daniel's going to continue on into Cyrus's reign. This verse doesn't mean he dies in the first year of King Cyrus. It just means he makes it through the transition. You have regime changes. A lot of times that doesn't end well for people in positions of authority. Normally you get a new guy on top and he cleans house and brings his own crew in. Daniel's going to have influence over this king. He's going to be influential with the king in Daniel chapter 5. He's going to be influential with the king in Daniel chapter 6. It's like you can't stop him from being influential. Not because of personality, but because of character. Even the new king, when he comes on, says, I need this guy around. I need this guy to give me some instruction, to give me some help. And so again, the influence here that we have can be lasting. Now, I understand influence is on God's timetable. I can't promise you 85 years of service like God's giving to Daniel. I don't know how long each of us has to serve. But what that doesn't discourage us, it encourages us. Take advantage of the opportunity we have now. And if the Lord's opportunity for you to influence others is going to be relatively short, then you need to maximize that. And if the Lord has a long period of service ahead for you, then you don't want to waste any of that. How much more opportunity do you have to influence others? And so that the point here is to make that decision. Go back to chapter 1, verse 8. And remind yourself, I'll start there. This kid in a foreign land, strange situation, so many pressures, makes one decision. I'm going to do right. I'm going to look for ways to continue to do right. I'm going to look for opportunities to bloom where I'm planted, to succeed where God has placed me, to be the best king's servant I can be without compromise. And we see the amazing things that God does throughout all of that. Well, as we come to the end of this first chapter of Daniel, what I want to do at the end of each one of these chapters is just kind of take the chapters as a whole. Just the nature of the time frame we have, sometimes we'll have to break chapters up. But if you don't allow me to just kind of step back and say, okay, what did we get out of chapter 1? What are some things that chapter 1 kind of reminds us of? What are some takeaways from this chapter? Let me share with you a few of these. First of all, one takeaway from chapter 1 is that sin has consequences. We know that one. But don't miss this. They're going into captivity because the nation has been wrong. As a culture, the nation of Israel had forgotten God and had gone off into idolatry. And, the very first verse of the chapter is that God sent the king of Babylon into Jerusalem. God brought about judgment upon the nation because of the sins that they had gotten into. I understand there's some differences between us and Israel. We're not Israel. We don't have some of the same covenant promises that God made with Israel. What God did with Israel was specifically because he told them part of their deal, their covenant was, if you go into idolatry, I'll send you into captivity. So I understand that's not us. But I do understand the consistent statement throughout Scripture, and we see it in the Psalms. Happy is the nation whose God is the Lord. That any nation that is going to serve God can expect certain things to happen, and any nation that rejects God can expect judgment. We see that throughout the Old Testament history. God frequently judged the nations around Israel. He didn't have a covenant with them, but he made sure he told them that you're accountable to do right. You're accountable for my righteousness. Righteousness exalteth the nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. I think as we look at our culture, we look at our society, I'm not trying to be pessimistic here, but I think we have to admit there's a lot of things off the rails. This culture does not seem to be getting better. It seems to be getting worse. And we ought not be surprised when that brings additional problems and conflicts. That's just the way sin works. We don't have to be the covenant nation of Israel to recognize that if we keep going down a path that God has said is wrong, it's not going to end well. So again, the takeaway from that is not to be discouraged. The point of that is to be encouraged. God needs righteous people now more than ever. These Christians are going to take a stand, and we're going to influence their neighbors, and we're going to even think about an election year, use their influence for righteousness in any way that we can. God's put us into this country for such a time as this, and so we have the opportunity not just to sit back and go, well, I guess it's over. We need to recognize, because judgment will come for a nation who is not righteous. We're going to be praying for revival, we're going to be seeking revival, we're going to be witnessing, we're going to be sharing and expanding our influence. to try to stave that. Because the book of Daniel teaches us that sin has consequences. Second takeaway or second lesson from chapter 1 is that even though sin is bringing consequences, God is faithful to his covenant. Part of God's covenant with Israel was not just that he would judge them if they sinned, but that he would protect them even in captivity, and he would eventually restore them. And we're going to see that all the way through this, that there's a dependence upon these individuals that God's promises are true. And that's what motivates them. Daniel didn't look at being taken into captivity as, well, I guess I don't have to obey those laws anymore because God's cast us away, so why should I care about him? No, Daniel's going to be committed to God even in the midst of national consequences. And he says, you know what, God's going to be faithful to his covenant. God's going to be faithful to his promises, so I'm going to do that. In a sense, the captivity is God keeping his word. And so that promise of captivity included the promise of restoration. So Daniel's not going to give up hope. He's not going to throw in the towel. He's going to be faithful, waiting for God to keep his promises. It's a good lesson for us to remember if we ever do find ourselves in a time of chastening. I think even personally, we make mistakes. We bring consequences. Personal sin has consequences, and there may be a time where we're suffering through the consequences for our sin. Like literally the problems we're in are because it's our own stupid fault. And those are also opportunities for us to get discouraged and to say, why bother? No, what we got to remember is that God is faithful. He's faithful and just to forgive our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. We can come back to him. We can ask for forgiveness, and he promises to give it to us. Daniel's going to remind us in this chapter that not only does sin have consequences, but God's faithful to his covenant. Great reminders in this chapter that is kind of broadening that application out. God is faithful to his people. God's going to use Daniel and his friends despite the friends of his nation, despite the sins of his nation. We might find ourselves in a culture suffering the consequences of national sin. We might find ourselves in a culture that continues to deteriorate. But we can still be beneficiaries of God's blessing. We can still do what's right individually. Even if culture doesn't change and if things don't turn around for our nation, we can still be committed to doing what's right because God is faithful to his people. It's worth it, and it's necessary for us to do the right thing no matter what's going on around us. We see examples in this chapter of God's faithfulness to bless those who are faithful to him. As we just saw in this specific example, the world gives us a lot of opportunities to compromise. We might find ourselves like Daniel a lot of times alone, where everybody around us seems to be giving in. There's not a whole lot of support around us to do what's right. No reason to do what's right other than to do what's right. And yet Daniel and his friends made that commitment. They said, even if nobody else does, we're going to. And we see an example in this passage about how God blesses that decision. God used that decision to stand for what's right, ultimately to expand Daniel's influence in ways that he never saw coming. And by the time we end the story of Daniel's life, he's going to find himself, the highest official in the land of Babylon, besides the king himself. I don't know that Daniel, when he was 15, making the decision that I'm going to stand by my convictions, ever envisioned that would be the outcome. But it was. Little decisions paved the way for big decisions. Make little compromises now, it makes it easier to make big compromises later. Make little right choices now, it makes it easier to make big right choices later. And we're going to see that evidenced already in Daniel's life. I mentioned this one too because this is probably a good takeaway for a lot of us, just overall from the book of Daniel. I think one of the most amazing things to me about Daniel is his ability to be faithful and serve the Lord in what none of us would connect with or assume is, full-time Christian ministry. We kind of think about, ministry, and I'm guilty of this because, it's what I do for a living. I'm in full-time Christian service, teach at a Christian college, and I do this full-time, and so you tend to kind of think about, it's important. I gotta serve the Lord, and this is my job, this is what I do. And you realize that most people are not doing that. Most people are going to a regular job without a Christian boss, in a Christian environment. They're not working in a Christian ministry, and we kind of wonder, How do you do that? How does Daniel remain faithful to God in the midst of Babylonian culture? He's working for the king of Babylon. And yet his story reminds us that this is possible. And if you find yourself in a position or an opportunity where it's not full-time Christian service, and you're working around other people and other environments and say, is it possible to serve the Lord? Of course it is. I can't help but even think about this, the idea of serving in government. Daniel gives me hope. You hear about Christians in Washington, you hear about Christian politicians, and you're like, how's that going to work out? Is that even possible? And Daniel reminds me it is. He could be all the way up to the basically the vice president of the country, and still do what's right, and still make right choices. So it reminds us, first of all, to pray for those individuals because they don't have the support group that many of us have built into to doing it. And also a reminder, if God calls any of us into those sorts of areas, no matter where you are, you can do right, you can serve the Lord, you can be faithful. Certainly ought to be more true for those of us who do work in a Christian ministry. We definitely have no excuses to make right choices and to do right. But no matter where you are, no matter what circumstances God leads you in, you can follow God, see His wisdom, apply it to the decisions that you make, and watch what God will do. Ultimately, what Daniel reminds us of in this chapter is that your stand for God matters. Little choices are not little choices at the end of the day. Take a stand, do what's right, and watch what God will do. Okay, let me give you a couple of announcements. I say a couple, they gave me a full sheet today, so if you'll bear with me. Some things that you need to know about that are going on. First of all, there's a Rejoice Radio Spring Share-a-thon coming up. There's Share-a-thon is Wednesday through Thursday, April 10th and 11th. And as I mentioned to you last week, they need help answering the phones. They give you instructions, you're reading a script, you're just asking questions and writing down answers, so it's not something that takes a lot of additional training for. They'll have everything for you, but if you're available and willing to help, if you can email rejoiceradio@rejoice.org, let them know some times on the 10th and 11th that you'll be available, even if it's just an hour time slot, saying I can do it from this hour to this hour. Let them know that, and they'll get back with you with a schedule. For the ladies in the room, there's another ladies' game night coming up. You're invited to the gathering place for a fun evening, Games and Fellowship, Friday, April 12th from 6 to 8:30. Bring a snack to share. I think this is listed in the bulletin as well, but I'll mention it to you. If your last name is A through M, they're asking for savory snacks. If your last name is N through Z, bring a sweet snack. So kind of fit into that category if you need to go by your maiden name in order to bring what you want to bring anyway. But if you would, go on to Realm and let them know you're coming so that they can know how many people to expect. One more church announcement before I get to one class announcement, and that's about guest and visitor parking. Every Sunday, Campus Church has dozens of guests, obviously, from both the community and around the country. Many of you notice as you come in, one of the things they've done is they've reserved some parking spots right along the first row of parking there in the Crown Center parking lot. Well, each week they run out of those. So what they've done is expanded that area. And so just kind of watch for the signs. They're putting signs up for which ones, but if you've been parking, okay, there's been 5 spots, and I've been parking in spot number 6. I just watch for that and see where the signs are, and let's leave those spots for guests. Also, be sensitive to that. As you see people around, you see people you don't recognize, say hi, introduce yourself. I know that around here it sometimes gets awkward because you introduce yourself to somebody and they're like, yeah, I've been working here for 25 years, and you're like, sorry. But we gotta step out. We gotta do that. That's why I plug for the name tags. I love the name tags thing because it takes away some of the awkwardness of trying to remember who somebody is or whatever. So thank you for doing that. We don't do it church-wide, so you're just going to have to introduce yourself to people. But watch for guests, especially coming up for this next week. Just about every church in America gets an influx of people who go to church just for Easter, and that's going to happen here. So just watch for people that you know that they're not normally a part of our church family. So welcome them into the church. All right, now one more class announcement. I want to commend you. I went to the Micah's Pantry page, the wish list there on Amazon, and when I looked at it a week ago, I mean, it was like you scroll. I looked at it this morning, there's 10 items left on it. So you guys are crushing it. And if you haven't yet, there's 10 items left on it. So I'm gonna send Megan a text later this afternoon just to kind of see, she's done this before, to see how she's thinking. sometime in the next, though, couple of weeks, we're gonna need to put together the party. So this is coming together really quick. The labels are in now. Bags were on the list, so she should have all the bags we need. So if we clear out this last 10 items, she'll have everything she needs to make another 200 gift bags, and we'll put something on the schedule. If any of you have suggestions or ideas for doing something, getting together for it, we can do it as a social, we can do it as just, hey, just go over for 15 minutes and we'll knock this stuff out. Whatever, talk to Linda or I, and we do need to put something on the calendar in the next couple of weeks to get this taken care of, because we'd love to get them, because they're out of vehicle bags at the hospital, so we want to get these put together and taken care of. All right, thank you for being here this week, and I will see you here next Sunday. We do still meet college students are combined next Sunday, but as far as I know, we're still here. So if you hear about combined Sunday school, that's not for us, that's just the college students.